Monday. It's a pretty cold and wet day here in Kansas City, which means I'm sitting in my office grading and indulging in some of my more commonwealthy Britishy mannerisms. I have one of my favorite coffee mugs that my brother bought me at the Royal Ontario Museum, filled with some English Darjeeling tea, and I'm just trying to keep from being damp. So I just wanted to start off by saying I thought the discussion forum was really quite good, right? The discussion forums really got at what I think those forums should be for, which is for us to deepen our understandings of the readings and to come at them with sort of open questions and a willingness to engage each other in disagreement and to try to think about where and when we might think about the applicability of the theories that we're talking about. So I have some thoughts about both forums, and hopefully they can help as we develop things a little bit. So there was a lot of really good points around bandwagoning and counterbalancing that I found in the discussion forums, right? And the idea here is to illustrate that when states elect to do these decisions, they're not necessarily just doing it because of some sort of actor-based consideration. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But that they're making decisions in a world that's not of their choosing or making, and that's really important, right? How states think about structure is an important consideration that we're trying to get at here, and it's one that I think we should keep well in mind. The idea here is that using structural thinking actually won't allow us to necessarily predict or determine the outcome of interstate politics. This was something that Mike was sort of reportedly bringing out. But I wanted to point out that what it really does is to help to discipline our thinking, right? It's to say to ourselves, when we look at decisions like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, like the United States' desire to see that become a strategic defeat for Russia, when we try to make a sense of which kinds of conflicts we will weigh into when we won't, structural theory at least conditions us to say, well, what is the current sort of structural environment that we find ourselves in? How conducive of it is it to the kinds of things that we want to achieve? And how might we best go about securing our interests? And I think that when it comes to thinking about Russia, a key question here is whether or not Russia is actually a great power, right? It's not actually all that clear that Russia is a great power, and that Russia's decisions and its uses of violence, as destructive or as morally moribund as they might be, actually raise to the level of changing the international system or structurally working against our interests, right? I also wanted to point out when we do that, though, know that there's an issue with unit level explanations. And actually, I wanted to point out that this sort of like took hold in the discussion forum. Many people sort of engaged in this and said, yeah, well, what about this? What about that? These kinds of things. But like, I wanted to point out that, especially in this one about Finland and Sweden, I just made up countries, Finland and Sweden. The animosities, fears, and historical context that lots of people are pointing to right now to saying, well, this is why they started to join NATO, they're not new. They've been there for 70, 80 years at this point, going all the way back to the end of the Second World War, and that this invasion triggered it to change. And this is actually illustrative of the problem with unit-level descriptions, right? They don't allow us to explain that, right? And this invasion actually seemed to precipitate some change. And I also wanted to point out that the annexation of Crimea in 2014 didn't have that effect either. It took this invasion. Now, there's lots of issues with structural theory and balance of threat that I brought up and that I agreed with and that I echoed in the discussion forum. But I did want to point out this idea that if we want to explain that, it's really difficult to do that unless we bring on to some sort of structural argument that helps us explain why. Forum 2 around Gilpin was also, I think, really critical of Gilpin, but I think there are some object lessons in here, not necessarily just because I think Gilpin is right, but just when we engage in this kind of thinking in order to help use it. Many people talked about how difficult it was to apply the concepts to the war in Ukraine, and what I wanted to point out is, like, in order to do that, you really do have to attend really closely to the concepts. Gilpin has a set of concepts around what a hegemony is, what hegemonic change is, what hegemonic war is, what differential growth looks like, and then a series of ways of thinking about how states should respond in those contexts. You should hew to those really, really closely. Instead of sort of loosely reading Gilpin and then loosely describing an event like the invasion of Ukraine, the goal is to actually be very deliberate. What does he describe as a hegemony? Do we have one? What does hegemonic change look like for Gilpin? Are we doing it? Right, so on and so forth. Now, what's important is that this is a structural theory, so we don't assume an action is the same as the structure. And this is another point about thinking about the balance of power more clearly. Yes, Russia has become an important threat in our public debate, but it is actually a great power, and are its actions actually undermining the sanctity or changing the underlying balance of power in the region? And are they just distracting us? This is actually a question that we as analysts would have to answer before it would become clear to us how to understand what's going on in structural terms. Now, a lot of you also said that you had a hard time thinking about what it is Gilpin was really getting at, and his argument was that the balance of power is very clear. Immediately after a conflict, it becomes increasingly less clear as states differentially grow, basically because it's easier for smaller states to catch up to great powers than it is for great powers to build up that lead, if you will, in the first instance. Now, what that means is if we're in that kind of environment and then we've taken the time to think more carefully about the nature of the international system, it should help us triage things, right? So depending on how you answer these questions and you use these concepts, either the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a hegemonic war, right? Because what it amounts to is a state questioning the balance of power in a particular place, and that whether or not it happens will dictate our ability to continue pushing our interests in the future. Or it's a regional matter that isn't connected to the international balance of power, and therefore might actually be the kind of conflict that's a bit of a sideshow, the kind of thing that a hegemony would get itself involved in when it shouldn't, right? And it should be retrenching itself in some way, shape, or form. Now, what I wanted to say about all of this is that notice how structural theory is a way to discipline how we think about global politics, not to tell us what we should think about global politics. We should think about these individual actions that we're seeing and think about them in structural terms in order to discipline our thinking, right? Lest we fall into some sort of murky or relativist arguments. Now, what do we have going this week? We have more or less what amounts to the other argument in structural terms. So, when you were if you were to organize the discipline of international relations until about 15 or 20 years ago, there are two main poles. There is liberal theory and there is realist theory. Both of those had taken on structural manifestations. They assume the same of the international environment in many constituent ways. Liberals agree with realists that the international system is anarchic. They agree with realists that there is no formal hierarchy in international relations, so there's no arbiter to appeal to. They also agree with realists that states and their relative power are the ultimate sort of foundational parts of international structure. Where they disagree is they actually argue that even under those conditions, institutions and forms of economic interdependence can produce environments that are more conducive for states to accept non-zero-sum logics and to cooperate more robustly, right? So that's the kind of theory that we're going to engage with this week, and we're reading some really important keynotes readings that relate to that. Also, we're going to get treatments from Chris and Mike this week, if I'm not mistaken, and those will be really great because they'll help us deepen our individual conversations about that. So just before they go ahead and do that, I'll give you a few thoughts about what a good treatment looks like so that you can vet them and think about them. So a good treatment has very specific characteristics. The idea here is that it gives a high-level summary of the argument so that someone can get a sense of it without having to read all of it. In order to do that, it should note key concepts, ideas, theories, or data that are integral to the whole argument, but it should also situate that argument in terms of the class, right? How does structural theory help us explain the international environment? And it should be critical, right? It should say, well, is this argument good? Does it help me explain something? If no, if not, so on and so forth. You'll each do one of these. As I said, that I assigned you each two so that you could do two and take the best rank, the best grade of the two, but you don't necessarily have to do both. The other thing that's going to come up this week is the first writing assignment, which I'll go ahead and say I'm more than willing to be a little bit flexible about because there's such a small class. And what I'm looking for you to do is to try to put into practice some of this theory in what looks like a very reasonable sort of real world situation. So the idea here is that most of these theories students struggle with in the abstract, but they do start to see some value in them once we try to apply them. And in this case, what I've asked you to do is take on the sort of position of an energy analyst. And the broad stroke here is that, if the global response to the war in Ukraine were to be stable, then energy companies may actually invest heavily in bringing new energy to the European market, right? If that's not going to persist, right, and that the war will either peter out and relationships will normalize or so on and so forth, then this is not a very good bet because then you'll very quickly be overcome and swamped by cheaper Russian gas. The question here is then, therefore, what are you going to base this argument on, right? And how would you expect the interactions between states to persist in the near future? You can't predict this with 100% certainty, but by using the different theories, you can make a reasonable guess, right? And that's what I'm basically asking you to do, is to put yourself in a position where, yes, you can't predict the future, but somebody is asking you for your best guess, and you need to structure that guess and think about it in a very disciplined way. And theory is a mechanism to help you do that. I do want to point out that, like everything else in the course, every piece of written material you write for me can be revised and resubmitted. So, go big, go broad, and if we need to make some changes, we can. There are some resources on how to write an effective briefing note that come after the assignment. I just wanted to point out that they're there, so make sure you review those. And just before I go, I wanted to give you a quick technical thing. So some of you have reached out about not being able to access the Zoom call. So in the Zoom tab, there is a little bit of a trick to this. If you go to the cloud recordings page, you go to the one you want, you say you want to download it, it asks you for the passcode here. You just click this little button here or even copy it, and then when it comes time to download it, you can put that passcode in order to watch the recording. All right. So thank you all so much for that. I'm looking forward to seeing you on Wednesday, those of you who can make it. I'm looking forward to some papers, and do realize that I do have office hours and contact information for you if you need to get in touch with me. Have a great soggy afternoon if you're here in Kansas City. If not, I hope the weather's a little better where